Hello, my name is CristinaLoi and I'm a PhD student in the ELITE project and I'm appointed at the University of Basel and University of Stavanger. Today I will present the preliminary results of a study that's part of my PhD project. First, I will introduce how the study is situated in the theoretical framework of transformative reading. All of our data were collected through an online survey that was targeted to 3 different reading practices. Then, since our aim is to locate which areas of the self are impacted by the transformative reading effects, I will present 2 strategies that we used to answer our question. We developed 4 tentative items to measure story world possible selves, and we ran a mixed methods content analysis on the reports written by those participants that had a transformative reading experience in the past 2 years. In both cases, we adhered to a view of the self-concept that was informed by Marcus and Nurius's theoretical framework. There is a growing body of research focusing on the transformative effects elicited by the reading fiction, which are often articulate these effects in terms of self-modifying feelings or self-altering experiences. The baseline of the transformative reading framework is that reading fiction deepens the perception of both self and others. And there are several findings that supports these effects. However, if we consider the media ecology of current reading practices, empirical research on transformative reading appears to be biased. We read in a digital era, but transformative effects are almost exclusively investigated within print fiction, and more specifically, within literary reading. Adjacent areas in reading studies addressed the comparison between reading in print and on digital devices, but this approach is only a partial solution because today reading fictional narratives can take many forms. So in contrast to this trend, the present study compares systematically transformative reading across 3 types of reading practices. We distributed an online survey targeted for the 3 groups of readers. First, readers of books. This category overlaps the most with what empirical studies on literary reading focus on usually, but we decided to adopt a value-free definition and to not distinguish between the medium, positioning imprint books and ebooks on the same level. This way, we can compare books with reading practices that are structurally different because they are digital born. In fact, the second target group is digital fiction, such as hypertext, interactive fiction, visual novels, literary games, and many others. And its defining trait is that each reading is different, either because the reader takes a different pathway through the text, or because the text offers a different version of itself. And this dynamic component is often prompted by interactive elements. For the third group, digital storytelling platforms, we will focus on Wattpad, which is the most popular among these platforms, with a readership of mainly young adults, mostly female. Like works of digital fiction, Wattpad stories are digital born, although one could easily print them out as if they were regular books without really altering the story. But they are read on computer screens or mobile devices, and they display features that we can label as interactive as well. Readers can comment on story chapters and even on single lines. And this aspect leads to a form of social authorship because to some extent, readers can influence the development of the story by making suggestions for story development. So once we set our population of interest, we had to deal with how to measure transformative reading. There are 2 approaches. One is to measure changes live as they are occurring, using usually experimenter-selected texts. And this allows to follow experimental protocols with quantitative methods, but it has some limitations because transformation seems to happen naturally and unexpectedly, and thus is favored by a match between text and reader. Another way to go is to carry out an extensive qualitative analysis on retrospective accounts of transformative reading experiences happened in the past. But this often entails a low number of participants. So similarly, we adopted a retrospective perspective and a bottom-up approach, considering as transformative what actual readers perceive as such. To prioritize ecological validity, we decided to turn to a wider range of readers, and we asked a simple question. Here you can see the formulation for readers of books. In the past couple of years, did you read a book that had a significant impact on you? For example, it made you realize something about yourself or others, it inspired you to do something, or it somehow changed your plans. And you may notice that we did not use the term transformative. This is because this term can be off-putting for readers. And instead we use the word cues such as realize, inspire to, change, which are all semantic domains related to transformative reading. In an overall sample of 814 participants, 543 reported a transformative reading experience with the reading practice for which they participated in the study. 227 were readers of books, 149 of digital fiction, and 167 were Wattpad readers. As anticipated, then, our aim is to trace the direction of transformative effects, which are usually distinguished between effects on the self and towards other people who may be distant in time or space, so they can be close to our personal lives, like friends and family, or they can be outgroups, distant cultures, or historical periods, and so on. And then we thought to add a third dimension that lies exactly at the crossroads between these two, human nature, which encloses transformative effects that are directed towards big concepts of communal interest, such as life, death, solitude, and so on. This dimension is recognizable because it puts together both the other and the self. It has some linguistic markers as well, because often participants use we or the inclusive you pronouns. But in this study, we focus mainly on the effects on the self, which is quite complex per se because the self concept is further divided in different domains. Marcus and Nurius proposed a view of the self concept as divided into self schemas and possible selves. Self schemas can either refer to our perception of who we are at the present moment in time, or to a series of past selves, versions of who we were in the past. In the empirical study of literature, the activation of self-schemas during reading are usually considered as elements of personal recognition, identification, and so on, or in the case of past selves, catharsis as well. On the other hand, possible selves are representations of what we think we might become in the future. They can differ in balance, either as wished-for possible selves or feared possible selves. We will refer to these types as positive and negative possible selves. They might be activated during reading in a process that is similar to the one described in the T-boats model as temporarily expanding the boundaries of the self. So with this theoretical framework in mind, we try the first step for locating where transformative reading impacts the self. Angeles Martinez proposed a notion that brings together the theory of possible selves in psychology with possible words theory, which is an approach from narratology that stresses the ontological crossing and transportation that are prompted by engaging with the story worlds. She coined the term story world possible selves, which are mental representations or projections of the self in story worlds, a process that is assumed to happen through identification with fictional characters. We developed 4 first tentative items, one of each type of story world possible self. We asked participants to rate their agreement to these sentences on a 7-point Likert scale, and we randomized these items with the story world absorption scale. Here you can see how the items were phrased. For example, one corresponding to the present self. I recognized several aspects of myself in one of the characters of the story. Or the negative story world possible self. While reading the story, I found myself worried that one day I could become like one of the characters. Let's take a look at the results. As you can see from the graph, the activation of story world possible selves seems to be more frequent with characters that either resemble the present self or embody a positive possible self. Encountering a character that embodies a past self or a negative possible self is less common in comparison, but still quite frequent. These results are also stable across all 3 groups. We also need to keep in mind that these data were collected about transformative reading experiences, which are a particular case by definition itself. Investigating the relationship between story world possible selves and absorption also yielded interesting results. The dimension measured by the SWOS are attention, emotional engagement, mental imagery, and transportation. Among these, emotional engagement and transportation were found to predict the activation of story world possible selves. As these concepts are respectively related to self-recognition and ontological crossing, these findings suggest a key role of such concepts as preconditions for the activation of story world possible selves. We can also note that for story world possible selves directed towards the present self schema or a positive possible self, which are the most common ones, for those, emotional engagement is the strongest predictor, whereas for past selves and negative possible selves, this role is taken over by transportation. Again, these results remain stable as well across the three groups. Overall, we can conclude that story world possible selves might be a good venue for future investigation, but for our purposes, they also have some limitations, namely the fact that they are bound to characters in a story and thus do not capture the effects of other story elements. Moreover, an activation of a story world possible self does not necessarily entail that it leads to long-lasting transformative effects. For these reasons, we decided to further locate where exactly in the self-concept fiction changes us by carrying out an extensive mixed method content analysis on the open answers provided by participants, where they were describing the impact that the text had on their lives. Here we report some examples from the data that were assigned the codes deriving from the theoretical framework. So a transformation directed towards a past self, for example, can mean to come to terms with a version of the self that preceded the reading experience, or it activates memories and it can have cathartic functions. Here's an example from a reader of digital fiction, which is the reason why the term game is used. Through the game's main character, I was able to relive the past in a safe, controlled environment, but this time with support. Then, a transformation directed towards the present self is when the reading experience impacted the self of the reader as it was perceived at the time of reading. For example, it made the participant view their own life differently, gain a deeper understanding of something, and so on. Whereas in the case of possible selves, we coded them every time that it was recognizable that the reader envisioned a future-oriented version of the self. He or she was then inspired, motivated to do something or change in some way. I won't go deep into the other examples as the coding scheme was quite articulated, but you can see that we coded also transformations directed towards human nature or others, like in the example in the right corner. The book opened my eyes concerning the mental health of people around me who are even close to me, like family. So me and a master student assign these codes. We adhere to the standard of inter-rater reliability, and then we turn them into numeric values to run quantitative analysis. The results are preliminary because so far we analyzed 50% of the data, but you can see similar patterns as with the previous story world possible selves. So transformative effects directed towards the present self are the most common, followed then by possible selves with a positive connotation. And so far, past selves and negative possible selves are much rarer, but this is understandable, especially for the latter, because we took into account reports of transformative experiences, and participants tend to report ones that have a positive rather than negative connotation. We also wanted to see what exactly in the text functions as a trigger for transformative effects. So every time an effect was coded, we also coded whether it was activated by a character, by formal or structural aspects of the text, such as style, or by more general story elements like plot or themes. Clearly, participants didn't always specify which type of activator did the trick for them, and so the more general content category is the most common. However, as you can see from the graphs, transformations directed towards the self were often prompted by form or characters. For the negative possible self, it was only story characters, although here we are talking about only 4 cases, so it is really difficult to draw conclusions at this stage of the analysis. One thing that stands out more instead is that For transformative effects directed towards human nature and others, the role of characters and even form seems to be less important. So far I presented findings on a more general level, but to conclude, I wanted to show you some preliminary results on how the three different reading practices compare in this respect. Effects on the present self are more common for readers of books and digital fiction, whereas positive possible selves are more frequent for the two digital reading practices. The case of a past self is interesting because digital fiction seems to elicit more of these cathartic experiences. And this can be due to the fact that readers are able to act as a character in the story, making choices on their behalf and trying several storylines. In the example cited before, for example, we saw that the participant talked about being able to relive the past. And then for what concerns the group of readers of books, it had all of the few occurrences of negative possible selves. And the participant experienced more effects towards human nature and towards others if we compare them to the other two digital-born reading practices. There are many more comparative results to analyze. In a quick sneak peek here, there's all of the areas of life that each transformative reading experience affected. For example, many Wattpad readers were inspired to start writing their own stories, configuring a type of transformation that is far less common for book readers. Another example is that transformative effects that fell under existential reflections on the meaning of life were much more common for readers of books. We are looking forward to analyze the rest of all of this data, and we hope that you will be interested to know more about our study. In the meantime, thank you very much for listening to this presentation.